Okay, we ready to go? Should we go? Good evening. My name is Dan Lundgren. I am a fellow here at the Institute of Politics, former member of Congress, former Attorney General of the state of California, currently a radio talk show host, and we have been talking on my show for several weeks now about the crisis in East Timor. Hopefully this panel will give people a little bit more knowledge about what this is all about. That's why we've entitled it Origins and Responses, some background where we are presently and the future. I can tell you as a member of Congress in the late 70s through the late 80s, East Timor was really not on my radar screen. It was an issue that most members of Congress did not know much about, and probably most members of Congress respected the American position, which was that we were concerned about the spread of communism in that part of the world, and therefore we had an alliance with Indonesia. During my 8 years as Attorney General in California, I was not involved in international issues and probably, like most Americans, did not know much about East Timor. As a talk show host on a network called Catholic Family Radio, this has come to my attention by way of listeners and others particularly concerned about this issue. And as a result, we began to devote particular attention to it and found that most Americans did not know that much about East Timor. Most Americans were not concerned about it. Most Americans couldn't spot it on the map. Now it is front and center in the public knowledge, at least in the public attention by way of the press. It's been on the front pages of newspapers. It has been on our television screens and our radios. But still, there is a huge knowledge gap in this whole question. We have presented a panel for you, or prepared a panel for you, which we think will give you some good information on this and allow some knowledgeable questioning and hopefully spread the word about what is actually happening there and why there has to be a consistency of action and a sustainability to the effort of the international community with the support of the United States. To help us in that regard, let me first introduce to you Arnold Cohen. Arnold Cohen is the biographer of Bishop Bello, the 1996 Nobel Peace Prize winner, Bishop Bello of East Timor. Interestingly enough, the only Catholic bishop to ever receive the award in the 100-year history of the Nobel Peace Prize. The book is called From the Place of the Dead. Arnold is a former investigative reporter for NBC News. He's written for The Nation, the Boston Globe, the Los Angeles Times, the New York Times, and many other publications, and currently lives in Washington, D.C. Arnold?
Thank you. There's a lot of ground to cover, and I want to do it as quickly as I can. The Indonesians invaded East Timor in December 1975. At that time in the United States, there may have been 25 people that had any reasonable knowledge of the situation. Of those, there were perhaps 3 or 4 specialists that lived in the New York area. I was involved in this as a journalist at a small radio station in upstate New York. I received some tapes about a few days after the invasion of East Timor, and they were by a very articulate young man named Jose Ramos Horta, audio tapes. And so I made some programs and became involved in that way. It was very much an accident of fate. If I hadn't been there at a certain time, if I hadn't been Jewish at Christmas time when everyone at the radio station went away and no one really wanted to work, and I got this material and found it was very intriguing and it really needed to be heard, what I didn't realize is there weren't too many people out there that wanted to hear about it, but in any case, it didn't stop me. The point is to speak to what Congressman Lundgren just said. Very few people knew about the Timor situation. There were groups in different parts of the country. There were groups here at Harvard. There were talks in the late 70s, meetings like this. There were not as many people, but there were people involved, activists from the very beginning. It didn't make all that much of a dent on policy until the late 70s when there was a famine in East Timor, which perhaps 200,000 people died during that period. And it was a war-related famine. It was something that the Indonesians concocted. And it was very tragic. It did get into the press. There were terrible photos. There were excellent editorials in the Boston Globe. A gentleman in the room, Mr. Alan Berger, wrote some of them. But still, there was not that much mass knowledge in the United States in any sense. There were some members of Congress involved. And there had been hearings in 1977 by then Congressman Don Fraser, who later became mayor of Minneapolis. But he was really the only congressman at the time that was concerned, and he was very isolated. So you had a situation, really, where terrible things were taking place, but very few people knew about them. There was a priest just 2 hours from here in Rhode Island, who was Bishop Bellows' high school teacher, who all through, before anyone else, spread the word, was helping the church in Timor with material aid and in trying to get information to the outside world. If it weren't for him, I don't think I ever would have been able to do any kind of decent work. But all that being the case, this was a very small group of people. The policy of the United States when Indonesia first went in, President Ford, Secretary of State Kissinger were in Indonesia in the days before the invasion. They basically gave the green light to the Indonesians. I think they regret it now. Both Ford and Kissinger clearly regret what they did, but it happened. The Carter administration inherited the Ford-Kissinger policy. They did nothing to change it. Actually, most of the people, as the New Republic magazine pointed out in 1979, most of the people who died in Timor had died during the Carter administration period. It is something that I think is to their everlasting shame. Their policy began to change in 79, 80 when there were some hearings in Congress. Congressman Tony Hall of Ohio, Congressman Tom Harkin pushed this forward. But it was very late in the Carter administration. And then they were gone when the Reagan administration came to power. And I think one needs to interweave this with American political reality. As we're in the Institute for Politics, it's important to have some sense of it. When the Reagan administration came to power, it was beginning at the beginning. There was a new administration. There was an inclination, as Congressman Lundgren said, to see Indonesia as a bulwark against communism. In 1981, there was a letter that circulated in the Senate that 27 senators signed, circulated by the late senator from California, S.I. Hayakawa. Unfortunately, the State Department really leaned on him, and he withdrew the letter at the last moment. It was bringing up humanitarian issues, some of which were still quite urgent at the time. And so there were Republicans in the Senate who were pushing things. Then Senator Durenberger, Senator Goldwater, a handful of other people. But it was very hard to make a dent. Suharto came to the United States in 1982, and according to the Far East Economic Review, the subject of Timor dominated his visit. I mean, it was really brought up everywhere he went. The unfortunate thing is that East Timor was closed to the outside world, and it was very hard to get news. And so if any administration said, well, this isn't happening, it was very hard to prove in any kind of simultaneous way that something indeed bad was happening. But it was. It continued that way. Bishop Bello took office in 1983. His predecessor came here to Harvard Law School in late 1983 to speak, late Monsignor Lopez. And he really had just come out of Timor, and he was totally devastated by what happened. He was a very conservative priest, a very, very decent man, but he felt that the world had deserted the Timorese people, which of course, in the main, they had. 1984, Bishop Bello took up his mantle. He was only then 36 years old, started speaking out, but he had very little support, either internally or externally. He was just in a very, very difficult situation. What happened then, and this shows that different things have worked in different ways, is there was pressure. Cardinal O'Connor of New York met Bello's predecessor and took up the issue and started writing the Reagan administration, at least got the Reagan administration to raise the issue privately with the Indonesians. Margaret Thatcher in Britain, at the behest of Catholic groups there in 1985, when she went to Indonesia, she raised the issue publicly with the Indonesian government. And it did help in terms of humanitarian aid to Timor at the time. I mean, I have good proof of this from people who were there at the time working in that field, and so that took place. But other than that, there was not much done. There were prisoners released as a result of, I mentioned, the trip of to heart of the United States in 1982, there were thousands of prisoners on Aturu Island across from Dili. A lot of them were released because of a combination of congressional pressure and some church pressure, U.S. Catholic Conference, et cetera. But the issue was not much of a public issue. This changed in 1991 when the Santa Cruz Massacre happened. And then for the first time, there were really, since the late 70s, there were comparatively large numbers of people, students and community people and church groups that were working at the grassroots on the Timor issue. But again, the Santa Cruz situation happened as a result of the film version of the filmed material on the massacre, but it was hard to follow that up. The place then became kind of closed off again, and there was nothing like the media coverage that we've seen in recent weeks. When the Clinton administration came to power, there were high hopes. Clinton, for the first time, sponsored a resolution at the UN Human Rights Commission in Geneva, had the United States sponsor this, and the Indonesians became very scared. What happened there, I don't know. From there's been a lot of talk about Clinton's relationship with various Indonesian parties. The only thing I would say is that whatever the intentions of the Clinton administration in this regard, and I have no way of knowing precisely what happened, it certainly created the impression in certain circles in Jakarta that they were not terribly hard on human rights in East Timor and so on, that even if the issue was raised, there were overriding considerations in terms of the relationships with Indonesia, and that the Clinton administration was not going to press them very hard. And I think that that prevailed until recent days when this crisis broke. And there was, briefly at least, a firestorm of criticism of the administration for the way that they were handling things. The tragedy that we have seen in East Timor in recent weeks, I believe, could have been prevented by timely application of American diplomatic clout. I firmly believe that. I believe that from having studied this on a diplomatic level for the past 23 years. When the United States has weighed in, and the reason that I mention these other incidents, the Carter administration in the late 70s helped get food into East Timor. A lot of people, more people would have starved to death than did if the Carter administration didn't finally become engaged in 79-80, point one. Point two, a lot of these prisoners on Aturu Island would have died or rotted there for years more if then Congress and the Reagan administration didn't do something quietly in the early 80s. Mid-80s, same thing with humanitarian aid. After Santa Cruz, the Bush administration, when they came under a lot of pressure from the Catholic Church, at a certain point they stopped the killing. It would have continued much longer. The point is when the United States chose to become engaged in this, it had an impact. And it didn't matter whether the administration was Democratic or Republican. When they chose to become engaged, Clinton administration in '94, when students took over the parking lot when Clinton was in Indonesia for the APEC meeting, Timorese students were there. There was a feeling there could be another Tiananmen Square if the Indonesian police burst in. They didn't do it. I think there were high-level warnings from the Clinton administration not to use any violence against these students and give them safe passage out of the country. So when we've chosen to become engaged, it's had an impact. And it's had an impact in recent days with this peacekeeping force getting in there, according to reporting and things that we've picked up along the way. It's clear that because the United States has finally done something, that these peacekeeping troops have come in. But they're mixed signals. They're mixed signals from the administration. How far are they willing to go? Right now, there are about 200,000 people in West Timor who've been moved over the past 2 weeks from East Timor, they're all threatened. All of these people are threatened. They're people who've been killed, independence activists that are picked out by these gangs, supposedly militias, but most of these are Indonesian soldiers in plainclothes, or thugs that they've picked up from the underworld in one place or another. All this is pretty well documented. And there isn't a sense now that the Clinton administration is necessarily engaged in this aspect of the issue, which at this point actually is a key aspect. It isn't clear how much they're going to really press the Indonesians to make sure that all these thugs are out of East Timor and that all Indonesian soldiers are out of East Timor. I mean, formal units may leave. It may look very good. There may be an exchange of, smiles between the current Indonesian commander. But the question is, what will this mean to the Timorese in the long run? Point is that what's done here in the United States does have an impact. this is a situation that can be solved, and hopefully people will want to engage themselves in this so that we have some type of way of recompense for these people who have suffered for more than 23 years. So I don't know if that's 10 minutes, but I'll answer questions later. Thank you.
Our next speaker is Matthew Jardine. He's the author of East Timor, Genocide in Paradise, and East Timor's Unfinished Struggle Inside the Timorese Resistance. He's authored op-ed pieces for the Washington Post, the International Herald Tribune, Newsday, Christian Science Monitor, and many other publications, and he's recently returned from East Timor, where he served as a UN-accredited election observer.
Thank you, and I'd like to thank the Institute of Politics and the Kennedy School for putting this together this evening. One of the difficult things about being in East Timor during this UN-organized election period, I was there for 2 months, was the very confusing nature of the political situation on the ground. On the one hand, it was a time of unprecedented political openness. There were pro-independence demonstrations in many parts of the country, including a demonstration of tens of thousands of pro-independence supporters just a few days before the ballot on August 30th. At the same time, it was a time of pervasive and profound fear and often terror. These seemingly contradictory phenomena were even present on August 30th, when 98.7%, that's really an incredible number, 98.7% of the registered voters came out and cast their ballots. And this really came home to me when I was near the Santa Cruz Cemetery, which Arnold just mentioned. It was the site of a massacre in 1991 where Indonesian troops fired on a crowd of thousands of people, unarmed people, and killed several hundred. I ran into this woman, and she was going to vote. She was with her young daughter. And she said to me, "This is the happiest day of my life. All of us here in East Timor have been waiting for 24 years for an opportunity like this, a chance to decide our political future. It's also the day of my greatest fear. I've never been so afraid that someone's going to kill me." When she found out I was from the US, she asked if Washington would be sending troops soon to help protect the people of East Timor, or if the United Nations would be doing so. I frequently heard such questions, and as I always told people, and it hurt me to tell them this, that I really doubted that it was going to happen on time, or excuse me, in time. In time for what? In time for what everyone feared was going to happen, the unleashing of an incredible wave of terror, what's happening right now. Nevertheless, many people in East Timor maintain this incredible faith that the international community would not let this happen. And when we talk about the international community, I'm using this term in the way like the New York Times uses it, or the Washington, D.C. establishment. We're not talking, unfortunately, about places like Namibia or Jamaica. Right? We're talking about world powers. Given the unequal, undemocratic nature of distribution of power in the world, we're talking about countries like the G7, the United States, OECD countries, the European Union, etc. Why the international community has failed in East Timor, is what I want to talk about for the next several minutes. Now, one thing I think we need to get rid of very quickly is this idea that is often put forth that what was lacking was sufficient information, right? That we just didn't know what was going to happen, and that's why we reacted so slowly. I would argue that the problem was not one of information. It was, as it has long been in the case of East Timor, a lack of political will on the part of the international community, narrowly defined. Kofi Annan said several months ago, quote, "It's a sad day for the United Nations and for the world. It is also a sad day for me personally." He said this in December '98 when the Clinton White House and the Blair government began bombing Iraq once again. But he could have said this about a lot of places. He could have said this about the killing fields in Cambodia and Rwanda, the napalmed villages of Vietnam, or the ethnically cleansed areas of the former Yugoslavia. The second half of the 20th century has hardly been one in which the UN's mission, stated mission, that is, quote, "to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war," has been fulfilled. Why? Well, the UN has been very successful in setting international human rights standards. It's been largely ineffective in protecting or realizing those standards. And I would argue that these failings are inherent in the structure of the United Nations, one designed largely to maintain rather than to challenge the global status quo. If we go back to 1945, when the UN was founded in San Francisco, Mexico's delegate to the convention had an interesting thing to say. He said, the UN Charter ensured that, quote, the mice would be disciplined, but the lions would be free. Right? The mice would be disciplined, but the lions would be free. Now, I would just add one amendment to that. Recent history shows that it's not only the lions that are free, but the mice with whom they're on good terms, like Indonesia, are also free. There have been a series of 10 UN resolutions from 1975 to 1982, including 2 in the Security Council, denouncing Indonesia's invasion, calling for an immediate Indonesian military withdrawal, and calling for Indonesia to allow for the establishment of conditions so the people of East Timor could realize their right to self-determination. Why were they never enforced? Well, all the members of the Security Council share some blame, especially France, the United Kingdom, and even the Soviet Union. But it's probably the United States that worked hardest to prevent effective UN action. Daniel Patrick Moynihan, who at the time was the Ford administration's UN ambassador, Ford administration's US ambassador, I believe he's a former professor here at Harvard, right? He wrote a book called A Dangerous Place. And he talked about his work in the United Nations on behalf of East Timor. And this is what he said, quote, the Department of State desired that the United Nations prove utterly ineffective in whatever measures it undertook. The task was given to me, and I carried it forward with no inconsiderable success. That's Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan, Democrat of New York. Despite a lot of lip service, there has long been a lot of hostility in Washington to effective instruments of international law. Again, the U.S. is not alone in this respect, but the U.S. is probably the most important because of the incredible power that the U.S. wields on the international scene. For Washington, D.C., the UN is usually only good to the extent that it serves as a means to what's defined in Washington as national interests. And they're very open about this. Let's just take John Bolton, who was the UN Undersecretary of State for International Organizations during the Bush administration. This is what he had to say in 1994. Quote, there is no United Nations. There is an international community that occasionally can be led by the only real power left in the world, and that is the United States. When it suits our interests and when we can get others to go along, when the U.S. leads, the UN will follow. When it suits our interests to do so, we will do so. When it does not suit our interests, we will not. And for Washington, effective UN action on East Timor has not suited U.S. interests. Rather, what has suited U.S. interests has been a cozy relationship with Jakarta. What we're seeing over the last couple of weeks, as the Clinton administration is finally responding, far too late, to what's going on in East Timor, is an incredible rewriting of history. Right after the Habibie government in Indonesia agreed to allow an international force in, Clinton administration officials began arguing in the pages of the Washington Post and the New York Times that it was because the U.S. had cultivated effective relationships with the military that the cooperation that Habibie extended was possible. Right? One official called these military ties, quote, a big plus, end quote. At the same time, U.S. officials like Madeleine Albright have expressed incredible shock and indignation at what's been going on there. Now, what's going on in East Timor is certainly shocking, but it's definitely not surprising. After all, we're talking about an Indonesian military establishment that's responsible for the deaths of 1/3 of the population since the invasion, well over 200,000 people. And there was plenty, as Arnold suggested, plenty of warning that this was going to happen. All right, and this is really the big crime from our perspective here in the United States. This could definitely have been prevented. As Arnold suggested, the U.S. has been intimately involved since 1975. U.S. President Ford and Kissinger were in Indonesia the 2 days prior to the invasion, gave the green light. According to the State Department, 90% of the weapons used in the invasion were supplied by the United States. There's been over $1 billion in arms sales by all administrations since the invasion. Thousands of Indonesian military officers have received training, including the notorious Kopassus, or Special Forces troops. Right? Last year, Secretary of Defense William Cohen was in Jakarta, the Indonesian capital, sitting beside Prabowo, dictator Suharto's son-in-law, At the time, Prabowo was the head of the Kopassus troops. They were watching the Kopassus troops go through 3 hours of maneuvers. This was a time when the Pentagon, behind the back of Congress, was providing something called JSET, Joint Combined Exchange Training, training programs to the Indonesian military that included advanced sniper techniques, urban warfare, counterinsurgency, and psychological warfare. Why? Well, as we all know here at the Kennedy School, what goes into foreign policy making is very complicated. But for reasons of time, let's boil it down to something very simple. And that is what's been prevalent, what's been most prominent in deciding U.S. Activities vis-a-vis East Timor and Indonesia has been corporate interests. And the State Department has made this very clear. In 1976, a State Department official explained U.S. policy on East Timor as follows, quote, "In terms of the bilateral relations between the U.S. and Indonesia, we are more or less condoning the incursion into East Timor. The United States wants to keep its relationship with Indonesia close and friendly. It's a nation we do a lot of business with." Right? Today, Indonesia is known by the Clinton administration as a big emerging market. And it's for this reason that the Clinton administration, it took 5 or 6 days after the mass killing started for the Clinton administration to finally agree to cut off military aid to Indonesia. And this was only because of significant grassroots pressure and the pressure of very principled members of Congress in both political parties. Now, in closing, I want to just talk about what to do, because this is about origins and responses. As I said, the Clinton administration has cut off all military ties, but this is only a temporary move. There are already signs that the Clinton administration is trying to reinstate military aid to Indonesia because of this supposed cooperation that we're seeing. Now, many of you received this flyer as you came in. I think it's from the East Timor Action Network. It talks about different congressional action that's taking place. There's bills in both the House and the Senate that would enshrine into law these cutoffs, in other words, making them permanent. It's very important that we totally cut off the Indonesian military. This is an institution that is proven very fully over the last 24 years, and certainly over the last couple of weeks, that it is totally an anathema to principles of democracy and human rights. I'm pulling a blank. The head of the UN Human Rights Commission, Mary Robinson, thank you, has called for a war crimes tribunal on East Timor. Well, we need a war crimes tribunal right here in the United States on U.S. complicity in the genocide in East Timor. And we should work to call for something that Congress and some independent organizations work to investigate what the U.S. has been doing over the last 24 years. We also need to talk about war reparations. If the U.S. has provided billions of dollars in economic and military assistance to Indonesia over the last 24 years, making the genocide possible, the U.S. needs to provide billions of dollars in reparations. This is a society that is totally destroyed, and it's going to take a long time to rebuild it. We owe the people of East Timor a great debt. Humanitarian aid, Grassroots International, here in Cambridge, is helping to coordinate activities in the United States to funnel humanitarian aid into East Timor. And the East Timor Action Network and Mobilization for Survival here in Boston are working very hard. For those of you who don't have the number of ETON Boston, it's 781-648-0548. On the longer term, we need to challenge the interests in the United States that have underlied this very criminal foreign policy that has resulted in so many deaths in East Timor. And this calls for a decorporatization and demilitarization of the U.S. foreign policy apparatus. In doing so, we'll be helping to increase the levels of democracy in our society. At the same time, we need to work to, given the failures of the UN system, we need to build effective and democratic international institutions. In doing so, we'll help do justice to the memory of so many people that have died in East Timor, and we'll also do justice to the best impulses of American society. Thank you very much.
Our third speaker is Bella Gallos, Canadian representative of the National Council of the East Timorese Resistance. She's a former member of the Indonesian Military Youth Corps during the Suharto regime. This was the corps that spied on opponents of the government. An East Timorese refugee living in exile in Ottawa, Canada now.
Well, thank you very much. There's one thing that hasn't been said about me, that I am learning English. For the last 5 years, I've been talking about the issue of East Timor in English. And sometimes, particularly this moment, I'm thinking that probably for the last 5 years, the government of Canada, US government, they don't understand my English. I feel like speaking my language to them. So the whole, the situation of East Timor has been well described by two of our speakers. I do not need to explain to you again about the whole detail of what's going on, what's the history of East Timor. And I can understand when some Canadian come up to me, or American come up to me and say that they never heard of East Timor. I can understand that. But I do not understand, and I will not understand if the Canadian government or the US government tell me that they don't know about what's going on in East Timor. They know very well, and they're involved in this. This genocide has been carrying on by the Indonesian military for the last 24 years. 1/3 of our people have killed. Some die of starvation. And this crying of freedom by our people have been carrying out for the last 24 years. I was only 3 years old when Indonesia invaded my country. I did not remember what was happened in '75, but I did see what happened in my country in my time when I was in my country 5 years ago. And we, as a young, we have been carrying on this struggle through our older generation. We've been speaking out throughout the country. So many of us living in exile is speaking for the last 24 years. The world knows very well about what happened in East Timor. What happened right now in East Timor is not a surprise. Even though I must say that I'm shocked with the extent of what happened in my country right now. I try to be talking as a Canadian, talking about East Timor, but unfortunately I am a Timorese, and my whole family back there, and I have no news about them. So the tragedy of East Timor is one of the world's best-kept secrets for the last 24 years. For years, Indonesia has been a favored trading partner of the Western countries because of its cheap labor and resources. That is why so many governments, including US government, Canada, have helped keep East Timor genocide a secret. And the resistance by our people is rewarded with disappearance, rape, torture, arrest, or murder for the last 24 years. Despite this risk, the East Timor believe that to resist is to win, and defiantly continue our struggle. And this month, we've shown to the world one more time that we want to be free. And what happened? And now, after all this tragedy, atrocity taking place, thousands of people have killed. Dili, the capital of East Timor, is flat out. There is nothing more you can account on in Dili. And now the peacekeeper are entering East Timor. For what now? What is left there to be kept? Nobody there. It's very hard for us, especially the young generation, to witness this over and over again. When our parents told us back in '75 about the invasion, we didn't really understand it. And even though I live in Canada for 5 years, but I can see and I can feel it, how hard it is for those who are still inside East Timor and those who are forcibly moved to western side of East Timor. So I do hope that there will be no more time for us who are living in a free country, spending most of our time discussion, talking and talking. Like Canadian government believe that for the last 24 years, the reason they do not take any strong action against Indonesia is that they believe that they should have more trade with Indonesia in order to influence this government to respect human rights in Indonesia and in East Timor. But the proof have shown 32 years in Indonesia, the name of democracy is still a dream for the Indonesian people. And self-determination, 24 years for the East Timorese people have taken 1/3 of our people's life. And it still continues still today, even though we already reclaim that we want to be free. And our rights to self-determination is well recognized in 10 resolutions by the United Nations, 2 from Security Council and 8 from General Assembly, and none one of them have been implemented. Why? Again, trade, business, money, from all of the countries that I mentioned, and have been mentioned very clearly today by 2 of our speakers. Now the only hope I have is that when I got back, just about a few months ago, I was hoping that this year will be the year for me to be reunited with my family. I have left them 5 years ago. And I was talking to my mom that this Christmas coming up, I might be able to spend with her. And we're all very excited because we know that the referendum will carry out and definitely we're gonna win this. And we're gonna show again to the world that this is what we wanted. And now that what we have planned have changed. And I know it's not gonna be possible. But I still hope that when I get back there, hopefully in a few months from now, there'll be still people live. And that will be up to you to really help us to stop the killings, the raping of innocent women, the killing of children. And basically, this is the whole, a total destruction of a country and its people. If we ask us, the Timorines, we have done a lot for the last 24 years. There's things that we cannot even name it, and the sacrifice that we have been putting out to pay price for this freedom that we just reclaimed it again a few weeks ago. Is it a time that you can have a chance to help us? Then please move quick to help those who are still left there. Thank you.
One country which has been perhaps first and foremost ready to move into this situation has been Australia. They have had troops ready and have been urging the international community to give approval of that, and they acted very swiftly. We have an individual in the audience who has some specific knowledge of that, special knowledge. His name is Alan Beam. He's the head of the International Policy Division of the Australian Defence Headquarters, which I understand would be the U.S. equivalent of Assistant Secretary of Defense. He's a specialist in Southeast Asia, has been working closely with his government on the current deployment of Australian peacekeeping forces to East Timor. He is doing research here at the Kennedy School, and I wonder if you'd like to say a few words.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Can you all hear me without a microphone?
Yes. Use the microphone.
You'd like the microphone? And for some of you, I'll talk with my back to you. Much less dangerous here than it is in Australia to talk with one's back to anybody. Ladies and gentlemen, my country, Australia, has taken very definite steps to seek to intervene in the tragedy that is East Timor. And you've heard tonight, I think, 3 quite different perspectives, very sensitive perspectives on what one can only describe as a shameful situation that has arisen certainly over the last 24 years, but in fact it goes back some 4 centuries. And one of the points, I'm going to make 4 points to you, and I won't contest anything that anybody has said, but I would, I think, make a couple of points which are about realism, because one of the things that one does in government, as many of you who are studying politics here will find out, is find yourself handling dilemmas all the time, where you're confronted inevitably by choices, none of which you really want. But the first point I'd like to make tonight is that the antecedents of the problem in East Timor do go back some 4 centuries. We're seeing here the working out of a decolonisation process which has been extremely messy. I don't know who to blame for that. Some might blame Pope Gregory VI, who divided the world up, or Pope Innocent. One of the curious things about Australia is the border between Western Australia and South Australia follows, in fact, the division of the world by the Pope. He is the one who decided that Portugal should go as far as East Timor, and Spain could have the Philippines. It's interesting, and you have to take that into account. One also has to take into account the Second War. Timor suffered enormously during the Second War, during the Japanese occupation of East Timor. And it's a country rather like Vietnam that has not seen peace much in this century. The second point I'd like to make is about the United Nations. Matthew Jardine spoke very eloquently about the many constraints on effective decision-making in the United Nations. I would only make one point, I think, and it's not about the P5 and it's not about the Security Council, it's about the process. The process for bringing a peace to East Timor is unique. If you look at all of the UN precedents for operations of this kind, the peacekeeping force precedes the vote. And in this case, we have had the conduct of a vote or a ballot, and then a dreadful process of retribution, and the peacekeeping force follows on. And that's a very difficult situation to manage, let me tell you. At this moment in East Timor, you have a collection of what you could only describe as homicidal psychotics who are roaming around the streets, simply killing people because that's the way they want to live now. So the process of bringing in a peacekeeping force really means that you have to take in a force which is going to confront military action. That's called peace enforcement, and it's very difficult to do. The third point I'd like to make is about pragmatism. In all of these things, you have to play the hand you're given. It would be nice to get good cards all the time. For those who play poker or those who play bridge, there is nothing worse than having a collection of a yabra, it's called in bridge, when you have nothing higher than a 9, and it's pretty hard to win a game. In dealing with Indonesia and East Timor, it has been grossly complicated by the fact that Indonesia is 200 million people and East Timor is less than 750,000 people. And so the balance of interests is something very difficult to establish. And as a person who has been seeking to manage a very complicated relationship with the Indonesian armed forces for the last number of years, let me tell you about some of the things that you need to calculate. One of the questions you have to ask yourself is whether it is actually good policy to impose rigorous sanctions which cut you off from any form of dialogue from those who are causing the pain. It's a question. Can I say that there is never a completely right answer? In maintaining dialogue with the TNI, as it's called, the Indonesian Armed Forces, what my government has been seeking to do is to moderate action. Have we succeeded in that? At some levels, yes, and at other levels, no. That is the nature of political dialogue as it's conducted between states. If one looks at the pattern of the United States history in dealing with the former Soviet Union, the management of power meant that in order to contain a really significantly great evil, other evils were tolerated. And certainly the former Soviet Union had no great record on human rights, nor did Suharto's regime either. So all I'm saying is that there are very careful choices which do have to be made, and one is never sure whether one's right or wrong. Dan, I might end my remarks there, and I'm just as happy to take comment and criticism as I'm sure anybody else on the panel is. Thank you.
All right, if there are questions, if you'd go to the mics and pose your question to any or all of the panelists. Yes, sir.
Hi, just to get the dialogue going a little. My name is James Williams, and I've worked with East Timor Action Network since shortly after it was founded. I'd first like to just quickly put out a couple comments on the speaker from Australia. I say good on you for going in there. I was a little bit saddened when I saw, the flotilla, it's going to take forever to get there. It would have been nice to have like helicopters and jets going in within a few days, but it does take a while to get there. But in terms of Australia's record, I think it's important that people know that Australia was the country that recognized Indonesian sovereignty over East Timor. And I saw, in a film I saw about East Timor, there was a shot of representatives of the Australian government toasting the carving up of the Timor Gap with representatives of the Indonesian government. There's a fair amount of oil in the Timor Gap. So I think I commend Australia for finally, I guess, and I don't say the United States doesn't bear responsibility as well, but I commend Australia for, and there have been massive, massive demonstrations that people here don't know what's been happening in Australia. They broke into the Prime Minister's office, if I'm not mistaken. I think that's what I was told a day or so ago by somebody who just came back from Australia. So Australia has made amends, but dialogue, finally, dialogue with military who are perpetrating human rights abuses is quite different from training them and arming them. I don't have any objection to dialogue, and that would go for the United States as well. Quickly, two questions. One is, Henry Kissinger, who flew out of Jakarta, I believe, the day before the invasion, has gone on to be on the board of directors of, I think, Freeport-McMoran. And could someone talk about what they've been doing in Indonesia? And I think there's also a question about the role of universities. Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy has a major auditorium funded by the Indonesian government. Harvard's Institute for International Development right next door here has had a very close relationship with Indonesia all the years that the occupation was taking place in East Timor. Could we have some explanation for where universities may have failed as well? Not just governments, but universities may have failed over the years. And finally, could we please have some very specific explanation of what legislation and action is being called for and the justification for it?
All right. Matthew?
Very briefly, is this working? Okay. The Freeport-McMoran is runs the largest gold mine in the world. It's in a place called Irian Jaya, or West Papua, the western half of the island of New Guinea. It's the largest taxpayer in Indonesia, and it's been there since the late 60s, since the Suharto regime came to power, and has long been a very significant player in trying to limit attempts to restrain U.S. assistance to Indonesia. Jim Bob Moffat, who's the CEO, is the golfing partner, for example, of Indonesian Foreign Minister Ali Alatas. And Jim Bob Moffat has worked very hard over the years to keep the gravy train running on Washington to go to Jakarta. That's all I can say about that. About the university, I mean, I think you've already said it, James. It's well known that places like Harvard and Tufts have long had ties into some very ugly things going on around the world. Your last question was about the specific pieces of legislation. There are two. House Resolution 2809, sponsored by Patrick Kennedy of Rhode Island, and Senate Bill 1568, sponsored by Russell Feingold of Wisconsin and now Senator Jesse Helms of North Carolina. These two bills would lock in the suspension of military assistance to Indonesia to prevent the Clinton administration from trying to resume it. And this is why this rogue theory that people are putting forth is very dangerous. You hear a lot in the papers that it's rogue elements of the Indonesian military. I should just add, someone, Mr. Beam from Australia referred to psychotic, what was the word?
Homicidal psychotics.
Yeah, right, homicidal psychotics. Those homicidal psychotics are the Indonesian military, all right? Just to be clear. These are there are no rogue elements. It's the military establishment that's responsible for this. And the reason they're arguing this rogue element thing is so they can then say, well, we've long worked with the responsible elements of the Indonesian military, and we're going to resume this so we can put them on a positive track. This is an institution that's rotten to its core. As you pointed out, there's no room for we can dialogue with them, but we don't want to train them and support them, keep them on the lifeline.
Alan? I mean, Arnold, excuse me. Yes, Son, you have to speak into it.
I would like to speak briefly to what Alan Bean said. And first of all, I want to say that I have the utmost admiration for what Australia is doing now. And the difficulty of what Australia is doing now, I think, can't be underestimated. I mean, Australia is is a country that's extremely large geographically, but was 20 million population? 19 million population. Indonesia is a country of 200 million people. It's like a huge umbrella over Australia in terms of Australians trying to fly to the outside world or so on, you know, overflight, just that alone. Australia is in a very vulnerable position. And they have to live in the neighborhood. And so what they're doing now is enormously courageous. A very close friend of mine in Australia named James Dunn was Australian consul in East Timor in the early 60s. James Dunn wasn't back to East Timor until recent weeks. He was one of the last people evacuated from the Hotel Turismo. With enormous courage, James is now over 70. He's a retired civil servant, stayed on until the very last minute. James Dunn has documented very well that in the mid-70s, really, there were things that before the Indonesians invaded that Australia might have done to have prevented all of this. Mr. Dunn was one of the people that wrote a lot of these policy papers. For many years, he was ostracized in government circles, at least to some extent, because of this. There are things that could have been done. The Timorese fought on the side of the Australians during the Second World War. I climbed a mountain with Bishop Bello. It's in my book there, Mount Ramalau, and we were with Archbishop Ian George of Adelaide, Australia. And Ian George was one-time military chaplain. And we talked about the fact that just looking at it, when you're there, you understand why no Australian could have survived for terribly long there without Timorese help. There's just no way it could have happened. I mean, the place is just too forbidding. If the local population was unfriendly to you, that would have been it. I mean, maybe for a while you would survive, but you know, you just couldn't get food or other things in the fight against the Japanese. And so for many years, there was a large segment of opinion in Australia feeling that the Timorese had really been betrayed and they needed some recompense. Now it's come to this. I wish it didn't have to come to this. I wish that during ex-Prime Minister Gough Whitlam's regime in 74, 75, that the right thing had been done. I agree with really most of what Mr. Bean said. The only thing that I would say simply is that sometimes it's better to have some preventative approach to such issues and to put on the pressure when one could still substantially achieve a lot of things without having it come to this, where over the years the Indonesians very consciously went out and tried to divide Timorese against Timorese, giving huge amounts of money, drugs, you know, torturing people, you name it, to try to create a situation in which, as an Indonesian military commander put it 4 years ago, quoted in my book, we will use the Timorese to destroy the Timorese. This is the type of situation now that we're faced with. And the only thing that I would hope now from Australia, in addition to the very courageous work they're doing, is that they would tell the truth to the Americans right now that this problem has to be solved. That means the people in West Timor have to be allowed to go home. Not half a job. They have to be allowed to go home, that the thugs who are in the hills, they all have to be removed from East Timor, and that really, once and for all, this problem be solved. Because I think that the kinds of half measures that were taken over the years have not really satisfied anyone, not least the Timorese.
Yes. Question?
Thank you. I also wanted to just respond to the different ways you can think about what happened to the people of East Timor in the recent past, and thinking of them as the militias as psychotic or homicidal psychotics on the one hand versus looking at the institution of the Indonesian military on the other. It leads you to two very different places. Calling them psychotic really kind of pins blame on a few individuals, and we have no idea what their psychiatric profiles are. We do know that the Indonesian military was heavily armed by the United States. If we address ourselves to the institution of the Indonesian military and to the institutions in the United States that armed the Indonesian military, then we're not in a position of throwing up our hands and saying, well, what can we do about these psychotic individuals? We're actually more able to address the root of the problem, which is the institutions in this country and in Indonesia, which give rise to this kind of violence and terror. My question to Matthew in part, and also to Bella in part, is you talked about reparations, and how do you suggest, I'm not sure what the precedent is in the United States on reparations to countries. One thing I'm concerned about is how do we both help and make reparations but not end up in a position where we try to control what happens, control the outcome of the country's economy and political system by being in there. And then to Bella, I wonder, is there an infrastructure in East Timor of any kind of infrastructure that could actually articulate what they do want from the United States at this point?
Well, the short answer is I have no answer to your question. But I think you raised some very important concerns. And if reparations are made in the spirit of contrition, rather than seeing aid as it's often used as a weapon, right, this would not be aid, this would be reparations, that I would hope that there would not be these types of strings attached. It would have to, if this were to happen, obviously the political landscape is such that there's not going to be a lot of openness to this right now. This would have to be the result of sustained political movements to bring this forward, not only in the United States, but in East Timor. If it were to happen, it would have to be done in a spirit of cooperation, and that might facilitate the prevention of the problems that you seem to be suggesting by your question. That's all I have to say on that.
Bella?
I think with the situation right now in East Timor, I don't know things, I didn't really follow up stuff here in US, but in Canada right now we push for a total sanction on the military between Canada and Indonesia. And this is absolutely, I totally agree and I support, because this regime needs to be isolated militarily. This has happened not just for East Timor, but also for Indonesia. There's people of Indonesia who are fighting for their democracy, and it's going to take those people a long time to finally reach their struggle. And so this is definitely, I support that whatever it is takes to put sanction on this government should be taking place very soon, because this is the only answer that they realize that the world no longer play with them. For the last 24 years with East Timor, and like in Canada, they always say that by having trade and with this regime, then they will increase numbers of awareness about human rights and this and that. It's all of the beautiful messages we heard. But when it comes to the reality, there's nothing really taking place in East Timor and also in Indonesia. If you remember 2 years ago when the APEC took place in Vancouver, and the influence that I see was the other way around, where our Canadian students being pepper sprayed in order to allow a dictatorship enter the country without being embarrassed by the people of Canada. This is really something that we need to think about and should push for. Should be a real push to make it a reality. And another question I don't really understand. If you could repeat it again.
Well, I realize as I sat down that I'm just wondering, is there an infrastructure of resistance in East Timor or in the diaspora that is articulating what you want from the United States in terms of reparations, or what would you say to a grassroots movement in the United States about what we should be pushing for?
Well, in this time, we do really focus on the life of people who are in West Timor. Indonesian military, they're trying to depopulating the whole population of East Timor. And the humanitarian aid mission should be sending in, and also have to make clear that they don't send those humanitarian aids through the local government, which is run by Indonesia. Because I heard from members of people who work in there, they mentioned very clear that apparently they divided those refugees to 3 camps, where one is Indonesian people who have been living in East Timor for many, many years, and another one Timorese who are pro-Indonesia, and another Timorese who are pro-independence. And those who are pro-independence seems to be mistreated, and they don't really get help, food, water, or medical supplies. So that's needed because we definitely want to save life here. And also, it's very important that peacekeepers are in East Timor, and hopefully that they could take control of a total situation in East Timor, and that this band of the militia is still running around and killing more people and kidnapping people either from West Timor or many other places in East Timor. And that's something that has to be act now before it's too late. And I don't know if
Okay,
I have...
we're going to have another question over here. Before, I'm just going to exercise the prerogative of the moderator to mention one thing. As a former member of Congress, I can tell you this. If you start talking about reparations by the United States government, before we're even to a point of sustaining an effort by the American people to support any action whatsoever, you're going to defeat your purpose. And I also just find it difficult that when we're looking at the Indonesian government, which is doing this sort of thing, at the very moment they're killing people and at the very moment we're trying to stop it, for us to turn around and beat the United States up and say we're the chief bad guys in this, to me, is just self-defeating. But next question.
My name is Lindsay Sobel, and I'm interested in hearing about the future of East Timor. It may be further down the road than we thought, but I'm interested, I guess from the whole panel, what a independent East Timorese constitution might look like, and what might be necessary in terms of either a reconciliation commission or panel and or war crimes tribunal.
Sometime back, Bishop Bello called for a Truth and Reconciliation Commission along the lines of Archbishop Tutu's commission in South Africa. I don't know what he feels about that right now. The point that I was getting to, the Congressman Lundgren just mentioned, was the question of reconstruction, because the other day, in our last conversation, Bishop Bello said, who's going to help us rebuild? All our schools are destroyed, the whole church is destroyed, what's going to happen? I think that people, as Congressman Lundgren said, have to take a practical approach as to how this works. I mean, even in instances when perhaps the United States should have given reparations, it's very, very difficult to convince Congress to do something unless the circumstances are quite special. In this case, they are, but it's a case of how this is put to Congress. There is enormous goodwill and a feeling of responsibility around the religious community, and not only Catholic, but also Protestant and also amongst Jewish groups. And so there would be some capacity over time, I think, to get substantial aid to East Timor, and not just the United States, but a conglomerate of countries in Europe and Australia, Scandinavia, etc. But again, at this point, it's important to save lives before it's too late. I think that in terms of constitutions and other things, realistically, what we're looking at is the United Nations perhaps having an administration in East Timor for 5, 6, 7, 8 years. Even before this happened, that was the plan among people that I spoke with from the UN when they went in to start organizing this election in May and June, and it was then the plan that even before any of this took place, so many people had been killed that there would be a need. Now you were asking, one of the speakers was saying, what are people inside asking for? We have no way of knowing really what kinds of casualties there's been. There's been a report that the 40-member staff of Caritas, the Catholic agency in East Timor, that they've all been killed. I happen to have known some of these people, very capable young university graduates. One of them wanted to become East Timor's first internet service provider. Another one was an economist working with the World Bank and other things. I hope that some of these reports were false. Some of the reports of church people being dead were false, some were true. One would hope that people have turned up, that in the midst of a confused situation, we don't really know who is dead and who is alive. But if a lot of these people are dead, if they really did go after most of the university graduates they considered pro-independence, this is a place that is going to need enormous help getting on its feet. It's going to take a really long time, and the world, first of all, has to be conscious of the enormity of what has taken place. That is, it's not simply wholesale killing. It's not people running around with machetes madly bashing people. They knew who they were going for.
Okay, we're almost out of time, so we're going to have quick questions and quick answers. Quick question.
I noticed that all of you on the panel were very critical of the United States government's relationship with Indonesia economically, especially with most favored nation trading status. However, we've seen that when the United States removes economic support and institutes economic sanctions, such as in Iraq, Actually, more people die of starvation and the infant mortality rate skyrockets. So what do you believe would be the best economic position for the East Timorese people for the United States government to take to ensure that more casualties don't occur in the upcoming months and years?
Quick responses if possible.
Well, if you remember what happened in South Africa, when Bishop Tutu was saying, you know, the situation in South Africa was like the people who are really suffering are the one under the letter, and those who are in power is on the top of the letter. When we shake the letters, who are the ones that fell? Those who are in power. So he said, suffer us, starving us, and in order to shake this regime, in order to shake what happened in apartheid in South Africa, and we bring it down. And if they could do it in South Africa, why not in Indonesia?
Yes, quick.
Hi, I'm from Burma. I'm a student here at the Kennedy School. I think there's something lacking in the discussion. Discussion has been through mainly between from the perspective of U.S. and the United Nations. But can you, any one of you, comment on the role of ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, not only on the recent facing last-minute attempt to contribute troops to the peacekeeping forces, but also the long-term ASEAN's involvement in Indonesia and East Timor?
I don't know that there's an ASEAN consensus. It's very difficult to have one because the ASEAN nations, Association of Southeast Asian Nations, has a principle of non-interference in internal affairs of other nations. However, that makes it all the more significant, the fact that Malaysia, Singapore, Philippines, Thailand especially, have taken the initiative to have troops involved, to have medical people involved in this peacekeeping mission. And so I think that this is an extremely encouraging development, and one would hope that Australia does not have this burden terribly long, because they have to live in the neighborhood, and the more that this really has an Asian face on it, the better. I might add, too, that I believe a very high-level Thai official was at Harvard in the late 70s and early 80s, and I think became educated on this issue at fora such as this. And so I think that the information has spread, and so it's not just a Western thing, so to speak. But I would say in the long term, I think that ASEAN would have a lot of sympathy toward East Timor. I mean, it's quite evident what is taking place, and I think they don't view what the Indonesian military has done as being in the interest of ASEAN at all.
My name is Helen Fine. This is to Mr. Cohn or anyone else. Can you discuss the implications of this for Indonesian democratization and the stance of the opposition parties, which are supposed to come into power in November, toward East Timor? So do you have any ideas about the role of the army in other communal disorders, in pogroms throughout Indonesia since Suharto has resigned?
Well, the implications are terrible for the democracy movement. I mean, look, some of the people who are the main authors of what has taken place in East Timor in recent months were people who were behind the killing of students in Jakarta in May of 1998 that really led to the overthrow of the Suharto regime. Now, if I were a member of the Indonesian democracy movement and took a look at this, what it would say to me is that the military at any time could strike back a la 1965, 1966, and really move very hard. I know Mr. Beam agrees, but still, it shows that overwhelming force can be used. Perhaps it wouldn't work the same way. Perhaps there would be civil conflict. As a matter of fact, I'd really like to turn this over to a specialist. Mr. Beam, please.
Don't force Mr. Beam to answer.
If he wants to. He was shaking his head.
He's here to talk with people afterwards. We really have to move along, so let me just have these last two questions real quick and real quick answers, because we're over time already. Oh, I'm sorry. I never saw you up there. Go right ahead. I'm sorry.
Yeah, I just had a quick question in response to something that the moderator said about us turning around and browbeating the U.S. My question is, this is not an isolated incident. Time and again, we see the United States supplying military aid and supporting regimes that are engaged in genocidal action. We saw it happen with Saddam Hussein in Iraq, and we're seeing it now in East Timor, and it's continuing in other places around the globe. And my question is, when are we going to learn to not come in with Band-Aid measures afterwards and congratulate ourselves, and to take action now to stop supporting regimes that are engaged in massive human rights violations around the globe?
Well, I think Mr. Beam put it rather well, that you don't have the best answer in all circumstances. You have two inadequate answers, oftentimes two. In international affairs, oftentimes you are dealing with the lesser of two evils, or the lesser of three evils. And you do the best you can under the circumstances. My point is that now we're at a point in time where we can assist the international community in doing the right thing, and we ought to do it under present-day circumstances. But we're trying to get the attention of the American people. The Timorese people are about 95% Catholic, and yet I find on my network trying to get Catholics interested in this is difficult, not because they don't want to, but it's so far off their radar screen. I've been to churches where we don't even pray for the people in East Timor. We pray for everything else. And these are our Catholic brethren over there. And my point is, you try and do the practical. You try and do as much good as you can in the short run, and then hopefully extend it in the long run. That's all. I'm just saying from a practical standpoint. But I'll guarantee you this. If you go into the Congress and start talking about reparations, your chances of getting support for the American people behind something like this are just about zero. Yes, sir.
I'm with Physicians for Human Rights, and this question is volleyed at Mr. Beam, if you would like to take it. We've done a lot of talking about the dead, which is important and obvious, but I'd like to talk about the living. Sorry, I'd like to talk about the dead for a moment. What plans does the international community, taking your loaded term, have for a war crimes tribunal and the effective exhumation and forensic investigations of the damage that's been done? That needs to be answered before we leave.
It's a very good question, and so far as I'm aware at this point, Kofi Annan has simply raised the issue of crimes against humanity without putting any further structure or substance behind it. I really don't know whether that is the course the United Nations is going to take at all. And I'd have to say, on evidence available to me at the moment, I rather suspect it's not. I think that what the United Nations will now seek to do is to institute some measure of public order and security, which we're having sort of 7,500, 8,000 international troops to do that, and then to look to some measure of economic development, which is a very tall order. Let me just point out that there are 3 points that are worth making here. The first is that up until the end of last year, East Timor produced less than 10% of its GDP. In other words, 90% of the money that's required to run East Timor comes from somewhere else. And so we can see already that there is a very big burden developing for the international aid agencies and for governments in providing substantial economic and other aid to East Timor. That actually is more important. That is, the support for the living is probably a bit more important than chasing those who killed all those other people. And I think that would be a high priority for my government. The second point I want to make is about the military aspects. In the Second World War, less than 300 Australians in Gulf Force, supported by the Timorese, completely sort of clogged up 25,000 Japanese troops. And that is the nature of the peacekeeping task in East Timor right now. It is a very, very significant military task, one which we are not looking forward to with any relish whatsoever. And the third point I'd like to make relates to the very excellent question asked by this lady here. That at this point in time, the Indonesian government is going through the most rapid pace of economic and political reform that has been seen in that island ever. And so one of the things we all have to bear in mind right now is that we don't want to do things with respect to the Indonesian military which make the translation of the people's vote in Indonesia more difficult to realise through its MPR meetings over the next 6 or 8 weeks. There will be a new president, probably Megawati, over the next few weeks. And so what the international community has to do is 2 difficult things. Support political reform and change in Indonesia while at the same time ensuring that Timor is in some respects repaired. And final point, I'd have to support the moderator's remarks about reparations. Be very politically astute about how you think about aid.
Last question.
Okay. This primarily goes out to Bella, but anybody with a Good answer, please give it. I work with the Campus Outreach Opportunity League. We work with university organizers all across the nation. And I sort of heard from you, Ms. Bella, a call to action and an urgency that that we, especially possibly the idealistic youth, should really get busy with some activism. What are some key ways that you see could help your people from students on this land?
I think, like I said today, our focus now is to save life. If there is a way that we can find to get in there and help the people who are starving, who have no medical supplies, who have no clean water and stuff like that, that's something that we have to focus as soon as possible, because for the last few days, there is no enough food, no enough medical supplies. People simply die because of that. Malnutrition, babies, so many babies die and nobody can afford milk and many other things, vitamins. So all this, if we can act quickly through World Vision, have been in East Timor and West Timor, if we can support them through World Vision, also should be done as soon as possible. And also keep on pushing, I guess, another things I said today is to put military sanction on this government also as soon as possible. And that's not only for a short time that the situation in East Timor has been taking place, but also it's for the future of Indonesia, for the struggle to gain democracy. Thank you.
Go ahead, man. Last word, Matthew.
Oh, sorry to take the last word.
Arnold wants the last word.
Okay, we'll give it to Arnold, thanks. Takes the pressure off me. In terms of activism, and this sort of responds to what we've heard from a number of people about the need to be realistic. I think it's important that activists, student activists, don't accept reality, right? Of course, we need to be cognizant of the different obstacles, the different parameters of political power in the world whenever we're acting politically. But reality, in the form of realpolitik, is literally killing us. It's reality, it's this realpolitik which resulted in the genocide in East Timor. And I find it very interesting that people from like government officials or former government officials from the United States and Australia put forth an argument that say we're given certain choices. Representatives from some of the most powerful countries in the world, as if they have nothing to do with the construction of these choices. Someone, a poet, and I'm not a big student of poetry, so I can't even remember the poet's name. He's from Brazil, and he once said, when one of us dream, it's just a dream. When all of us dream, it becomes reality. It's important that we have dreams. It's important that we fight for principled objectives. Even if reparations might lose, it's important to put it forth because it raises U.S. responsibility for the killings that have taken place. Right? And if we don't dream, we're going to continue to suffer the nightmares that the people of East Timor are suffering right now.
Arnold.
I'm not saying this in any way to contradict Matthew. I mean, if I didn't dream, I wouldn't have worked on East Timor for nearly 24 years. But the one thing that I would like to say is at this moment, it's of the utmost importance that concrete action be taken so that these thugs that are running around the hills, any renegade Indonesian military people or Indonesian military people are under the utmost pressure from the United States and other nations to basically desist, disarm, and get out of there, and that the people in West Timor and other islands have their situation addressed as soon as possible. If these are the very immediate concrete things, if these things aren't handled, we're not going to have a whole lot else. So I think that we have to have maximum pressure on this end to address these issues before it's too late, and we don't have much time.
All right, I'd like to thank our panelists for a lively and informed discussion, and thank all of you for your participation as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dan.
Thank you.